A few years ago, I took a solo trip to the Pacific Northwest. I had always loved forests, especially the kind that seem endless, the kind where tall trees grow so close together that the sky turns into thin strips of gray above you. The Pacific Northwest has forests exactly like that, deep, quiet, and old. I flew into Seattle and rented a small pickup truck. My plan was simple. I wanted to drive out toward the more remote areas in Washington state, find a quiet place to camp, and spend a few days fishing and hiking. Nothing fancy. Just me, a tent, and the woods. A local guy at a gas station suggested a forest road not too far from the Olympic Peninsula. He said it was quiet and that most tourists never bothered going that far. That sounded perfect to me. The road started out normal enough, paved at first, then slowly turning into rough gravel. The trees grew taller and thicker the farther I drove. After about an hour, my phone lost signal completely. I did not really care. In fact, I liked it. It felt like stepping away from the world for a while. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a narrow river. The water moved slowly and looked perfect for fishing. Moss covered almost everything around me. The ground felt soft under my boots, and the air smelled damp and clean. It was one of those places that felt peaceful the moment you stepped out of the car. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing. Nothing fancy, just a small camping tent I had used many times before. By the time I finished, the sun had already started dropping behind the trees. In forests like that, evening arrives earlier than you expect. I cooked a simple meal over a small camping stove and sat on a fallen tree while I ate. The forest was quiet, but not empty. I could hear the river, distant birds, and wind moving through the tall branches far above me. Everything felt normal. But after a while, I noticed something strange. The birds slowly stopped making noise. At first, I thought it was just because night was coming. That seemed reasonable. Still, the silence felt heavier than usual. The kind of silence where you suddenly realize how alone you are. I shrugged it off and focused on cleaning up my cooking gear. While I was packing things away, I heard something moving deeper in the forest. Not close. Maybe 30 or 40 yards away. At first, it sounded like something large walking through wet leaves and small branches. My first thought was a deer. There are plenty of them in that part of the country. I even grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back. But I saw nothing. The light just disappeared into thick trunks and hanging moss. The movement stopped too. I stood there for a moment listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no animals running away. Just the slow river behind me. After a minute, I laughed a little at myself. When you are alone in a big forest, your brain starts imagining things. That is pretty normal. So I turned off the flashlight and climbed into my tent. At first, everything felt peaceful again. I lay inside my sleeping bag and listened to the forest settle into night. The wind moved softly through the tall trees, making them sway slowly above the clearing. Eventually, I started drifting towards sleep. Then something strange happened. From somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard a sound that made my eyes open immediately. It was not an animal call that I recognized. It sounded almost like someone trying to imitate a human voice, but doing it badly. Not words, just a long, uneven sound that slowly faded into the trees. I stayed very still inside my tent. At first I tried to tell myself it was probably some kind of bird, maybe an owl or another night animal I had never heard before. The forests in that region are full of strange wildlife sounds. Still, something about it did not feel right. A few minutes passed. Then I heard movement again. This time it was closer to the clearing. Slow steps moving through leaves and branches, the kind of movement that suggested something heavy. I held my breath and listened carefully. The steps stopped somewhere near the edge of the trees. Whoever or whatever it was did not come closer. It just stayed there, waiting. I remember staring at the thin fabric wall of my tent, suddenly very aware of how little protection it offered. And then very slowly, I began to realize something that made my stomach tighten. The sound I had heard earlier, the strange voice-like sound, it came from the exact same direction where those slow steps were now standing. And whatever was out there had not left. It was still just beyond the clearing, standing in the darkness, listening. I stayed completely still inside my sleeping bag. At that moment, every small sound inside the tent suddenly felt too loud, the fabric moving slightly when I breathed, the quiet shift of my jacket when I moved my arm a little. Even my heartbeat felt heavy in my ears. Outside the tent, the forest remained quiet, but the feeling that something was standing near the trees did not go away. You know how sometimes your body reacts before your mind understands why? That is exactly what happened to me. I had no clear proof that anything was there, but my instincts kept telling me I was being watched. Several minutes passed like that. Then I heard the slow movement again. Leaves moved softly. A branch bent somewhere near the edge of the clearing. Whatever it was had started walking again, but the steps were slow and careful. It moved a few yards, then stopped. Then it moved again. Each time it moved, it seemed a little closer to my tent. I slowly reached for the flashlight beside my backpack. I did it carefully, trying not to make unnecessary noise. My hand felt cold, even though I was inside my sleeping bag. For a moment, I considered stepping outside to check, but that idea disappeared almost immediately. Something deep inside me said that opening the tent and walking into that darkness would be a very bad decision. So I stayed where I was. The steps stopped again. Now it felt very close. Not right next to the tent, but close enough that I could hear the faint sound of breathing somewhere outside. Slow, steady breathing. At least I thought it was breathing. I held the flashlight in my hand, ready to switch it on if I needed to. Another minute passed. Then I heard something that made my stomach tighten. The same strange sound from earlier came again, that uneven voice-like sound. But this time it was clearer and closer. It still did not sound like real speech. It sounded like something trying to shape a human voice, but failing in a strange way. The tone went up and down slowly, almost like someone remembering how to speak. I felt a chill run through my back, because for a brief second the sound almost resembled a word. My name. Now I know how that sounds. When people get scared, the brain can play tricks. I understand that. But lying there in the darkness, I was sure that the sound almost formed my name. I had not told anyone where exactly I was camping. No one knew I was in that clearing. The breathing outside stopped. The forest went completely silent again. Then something moved along the outside edge of the tent, not touching it, just slowly walking around it. I could hear leaves shifting under slow steps. The sound circled from one side of the tent to the other. At that point, I switched on the flashlight. The beam filled the inside of the tent with white light, but it did not help much. The walls of the tent were thick enough that I could not see any shape outside. But the movement stopped immediately. For several seconds, nothing happened. I waited. Then I slowly turned off the flashlight again. The darkness returned instantly. And almost right away, the breathing started again. This time it was closer than before. So close that it sounded like it was right beside the tent wall. I could hear the slow pull of air. Then a long pause, Then another slow breath. I lay there frozen, staring at the dark fabric a few inches from my face. My mind kept trying to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe a large animal had wandered into the clearing. But bears usually move differently. They make heavier sounds. They also tend to move around a campsite more directly if they smell food. This thing felt different. It felt cautious, like it was studying the tent. Another long minute passed. Then, very quietly, the strange voice-like sound came again. And this time, it was right outside my tent. Slow, unnatural, and much closer to forming a human word. At that point, I stopped trying to explain it. My brain had already run through every normal possibility. Deer, bear, another camper who had wandered too far into the forest. None of those ideas fit what I was hearing outside the tent. The breathing stayed close to the fabric wall, slow, patient. I could feel my body getting tense from lying still for so long, but I did not dare move too much. Every small shift of my sleeping bag sounded louder than it should have. Then the strange voice came again, long and uneven. It almost sounded like someone trying to remember how human speech works. The tone rose and fell slowly, like the voice was shaping sounds one piece at a time. For a moment, it almost formed another word. Then it faded into the dark forest. After that, the breathing stopped. Completely. That silence felt worse than the sounds before. I stayed there for several minutes, waiting for the next movement. Nothing happened. The clearing outside seemed completely empty again. Eventually, I forced myself to move. Very slowly, I reached toward the zipper of the tent door. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I told myself I only wanted to take a quick look. Just one look with the flashlight. The zipper moved slowly as I opened a small gap in the tent door. Cool night air slipped inside immediately. The forest smelled damp and heavy. I lifted the flashlight and pointed it through the opening. The beam spread across the clearing. The river behind the camp reflected the light softly. My truck sat where I had parked it earlier. Everything looked exactly the same as before. No animals, no people, just trees and darkness. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe the whole thing really had been some strange animal after all. Then my flashlight moved toward the tree line, and I saw something that made the relief disappear instantly. There were footprints in the soft moss near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought they were just animal tracks. But when I looked closer, I realized something was wrong with that idea. The shapes looked too long, too narrow, and spaced too far apart. They were not deer tracks, not bear tracks either. They looked almost like human footprints, but longer than any human foot should be. My flashlight followed the trail slowly. The tracks came from the forest, crossed part of the clearing, then stopped only a few feet away from my tent, right where I had been hearing the breathing. I felt a heavy weight settle in my chest when I saw the next part. The footprints did not continue past the tent. They simply turned around and went back toward the trees. Like whatever made them had stood there for a long time before walking away. I kept the flashlight pointed toward the forest, expecting to see movement between the trunks. But the trees stood perfectly still. The hanging moss moved gently with the wind high above the ground. Nothing else moved. Eventually, I closed the tent door again and locked the zipper in place, even though I knew that would not stop anything if it truly wanted to come inside. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat there for hours, listening carefully to every sound in the forest. Most of the night stayed quiet. But sometime before morning, when the sky was still dark gray, I heard that strange voice again. far away this time, deep in the forest. The same uneven sound that almost resembled a human voice. Only now it sounded different. It sounded like it was repeating something, over and over. The sound drifted through the forest slowly. It was far enough away that I could not clearly understand it, but the rhythm of it felt familiar. The tone rose and fell in the same strange way I had heard earlier in the night. Only now it repeated again and again. The best way I can describe it is that it sounded like someone practicing a word they did not fully understand. Each time it came, the shape of the sound felt a little closer to something human. I stayed inside the tent until the first hint of morning light appeared between the trees. The sky turned from black to a dull gray, and the forest slowly started making normal sounds again. Birds began calling from the higher branches, and the river behind the clearing sounded louder now that the night silence was gone. As soon as there was enough light to see clearly, I packed my things. I did not cook breakfast. I did not go fishing. My only plan was to leave. And while taking down the tent, I kept looking toward the tree line where I had seen the footprints earlier. In daylight, the forest looked normal again. Just tall trees covered in moss and thick ferns growing across the ground. Still, I could not shake the feeling that something in those woods had been studying me the entire night. Before getting into the truck, I walked over to the edge of the clearing one more time. I wanted to see the footprints again in the daylight just to be sure my eyes had not played tricks on me. They were still there. Long shapes pressed into the soft moss, clear enough that I could follow the path easily. They came out of the forest, stopped near where my tent had been, then returned the same way they came. I stood there for a moment, looking into the trees. The forest beyond the clearing was thick and dark even during the day. The branches above formed a heavy roof of green that blocked most of the sunlight. For a second, I considered following the tracks. Curiosity can do strange things to people. A part of my mind wanted to see where they led, but another part of me remembered the sound of that voice outside the tent and the slow breathing beside the fabric wall. That second part of my mind won the argument. I got into the truck and started driving back down the gravel road. The forest slowly opened up as the miles passed, and eventually my phone signal returned. About an hour later, I stopped at a small diner near a quiet highway. I must have looked tired because the waitress asked if I had been camping nearby. I told her where I had stayed. Her expression changed in a way that made my stomach tighten again. She said people sometimes camp out there, but most locals avoid that area of the forest. When I asked why, she hesitated for a moment before answering. She told me that hikers occasionally report hearing strange voices deep in those woods. Not clear voices. Just something that almost sounds human. The strange part, she said, is that the sound sometimes seems to copy people. Not perfectly, but close enough to make them stop and listen. Then she added one more thing that stayed with me long after that trip. She said the voices usually appear when someone is alone, and they always seem to be trying to learn how people speak. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and drove away without saying much else. But even now, years later, I still remember one detail from that night that I did not tell the waitress. When that distant voice repeated its strange sound before sunrise, the rhythm of it slowly became clearer, because by the final time I heard it, the sound was no longer random. It had finally shaped itself into a word. My name. I have been driving trucks across the Pacific Northwest for almost 9 years. Most weeks I move loads between small towns in Washington State, Oregon, and sometimes up into British Columbia. It is a quiet kind of job. Long roads, tall trees, fog hanging low in the early morning. Some drivers hate the silence, but I always liked it. You get used to the rhythm of the road, engine humming, tires rolling over the pavement, miles passing slowly while forests stretch out on both sides. Most nights are simple. You drive, listen to the radio, stop for gas, maybe grab coffee at a lonely truck stop that smells like burnt beans and old carpet. But there was one night last fall that still bothers me when I think about it. I was hauling a refrigerated trailer full of packaged seafood from the coast near Astoria. The delivery was supposed to reach a warehouse outside Tacoma before sunrise. Normally, I would take the main highway, but there was construction that night. My GPS suggested a smaller route that cut through forest roads. It would save almost an hour, so I took it without thinking too much. The road quickly became quieter than I expected. No gas stations, no houses, just dark trees standing close together along both sides of the road. If you have never driven through the Pacific Northwest at night, it is hard to explain how dark the forest can be. The trees grow tall and thick, and when the fog moves in, the headlights only show a short distance ahead. Everything else disappears into gray shadow. About an hour into the drive, I noticed another truck behind me. At first, it did not seem strange. Truckers pass each other all the time on long routes, but this one stayed behind me for a long time. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It kept the same distance the entire time, far enough that I could mostly see its headlights through the mirrors, but never close enough to pass. I remember thinking it was odd because this road had plenty of straight stretches where passing would have been easy. Eventually, I pulled into a small gravel turnout so the driver could go around. But the truck behind me did not pass. It also pulled into the turnout. That was the first moment I felt something was off. Both trucks sat there with engines running. No one got out. No lights inside the other cab. Just a dark truck sitting about 50 feet behind mine. I waited for a minute, thinking maybe the driver needed a rest break too. Then another minute passed. Still nothing. After about 5 minutes, I decided to just get back on the road. As I pulled out, the other truck pulled out too. And that was when the uneasy feeling really started. Because the road ahead was empty for miles, yet the driver behind me still refused to pass. At that point, I told myself I was probably overthinking things. Truck drivers sometimes just follow each other at night because it feels safer on quiet roads. Still, something about the way that truck stayed behind me felt strange. Not aggressive, not impatient, just watching. And about 40 minutes later, something happened that made me wish I had never taken that forest road at all. By the time I had been driving another 40 minutes, the fog had become thicker. My headlights were pushing through it, but only barely. The trees along the road looked like tall, dark walls on both sides. The other truck was still behind me. Same distance, same quiet following. At that point, I started checking my mirrors more often than usual. Not in a nervous way at first, just curiosity. Most drivers would have passed by now. Then I noticed something that made my stomach feel heavy. The truck behind me did not have a company logo. That might not sound strange, but most freight trucks do. A name on the door, a number on the side, something that shows who owns the vehicle. This truck looked completely plain, dark paint. No markings, no trailer numbers that I could see, just a long shape moving slowly through the fog. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the driver worked for a small independent company. That happens sometimes. Still, something about the situation felt wrong. About 10 minutes later, I reached a narrow bridge crossing a deep river valley. The road curved sharply before the bridge, which forced me to slow down. That was when the truck behind me finally moved closer. Not dangerously close, but much closer than before. For the first time, I could see part of the cab clearly in my mirror. The headlights lit up the front of the truck, and I noticed something strange. The windshield looked completely dark, not like normal tinted glass. It looked almost black. No shape inside. No driver visible. Now I know that lighting can play tricks on your eyes at night. Mirrors distort things. Fog bends light in strange ways. I understand all of that. But I have driven for many years, and I know what a truck cab normally looks like. In headlights, usually see the driver moving, adjusting something, turning their head, anything. This cab looked empty. Still, the truck kept moving perfectly with the road, staying behind me like it had been doing for the past hour. When I reached the other side of the bridge, I decided to pull into the next rest area. There was a small one ahead that I remembered from past trips. Just a gravel lot surrounded by tall trees, a few picnic tables, a single old restroom building. I turned in slowly and parked near the edge of the lot. The other truck followed me again, but instead of parking beside me or across the lot, it stopped farther back near the entrance. Its headlights stayed on, pointed directly toward my truck. That light filled my mirrors and made it hard to see anything behind me. I sat there for a moment thinking about what to do. Part of me wanted to step outside and ask the driver if everything was okay. Truck drivers help each other all the time, but something about the situation made me stay in my seat. The forest around the rest area was completely silent. No other vehicles, no wind, just fog drifting slowly through the trees. I kept watching my mirrors, waiting for the driver of that truck to finally step out. But after several minutes passed, I realized something unsettling. No door opened. No person walked out. The truck just sat there, engine running, lights shining forward, and the cab still looked completely dark inside. That was the moment when a quiet thought crossed my mind. What if there was no driver in that truck at all? I sat in my seat for a long moment just watching the mirrors. The headlights from the truck behind me filled the entire back of my cab with pale light. It made the fog glow in a strange way. Everything outside looked flat and colorless. I kept waiting for the driver to step out. 5 minutes passed, then maybe 10. Nothing changed. The truck stayed exactly where it was, near the entrance of the rest area. The engine sounded steady. The lights stayed on, but no one came out. I started thinking about all the normal reasons a driver might stay inside the cab. Maybe they were sleeping. Maybe they were on the phone. Maybe they were just resting. Still, something did not feel normal. Truck drivers usually move around inside their cab. Even if someone is sitting still, you can usually see small movements through the glass. But that windshield still looked completely dark. Finally, I decided I had been sitting there too long. I still had a delivery to make before sunrise, and staying in that quiet rest area was starting to make me uncomfortable. So I started my engine again and slowly pulled back toward the road. As I drove past the other truck, I looked over for just a second. My headlights passed across the front of the cab. For a moment, the light touched the windshield, and I saw something inside. Not a driver, just an empty seat. I remember feeling a cold sensation run through my chest. I told myself it had to be the angle of the light. Maybe the driver was leaning down or reaching for something. There had to be a simple explanation. I pulled back onto the road and continued north. For a few seconds, the rest area disappeared behind me in the fog. Then I looked in the mirror again. The other truck was coming back onto the road too, still following me, still the same distance behind. At that point, my mind started racing. I tried to think of normal reasons why this might be happening. Maybe the driver had stepped out earlier, and I simply did not notice. Maybe the dark glass was hiding everything. Maybe I was just tired and imagining things. But another thought slowly pushed its way into my mind. If that seat was empty when I passed the truck, then who was driving it now? The road ahead continued through thick forest, no towns, no lights in the distance, just long stretches of pavement disappearing into fog. The truck behind me stayed there for another 20 minutes. Then something happened that made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. The headlights behind me slowly moved closer again, closer than they had ever been before, so close that I could see the full shape of the cab in my mirrors. And that was when the interior light inside the truck suddenly turned on. For the first time, I could clearly see the driver's seat. It was completely empty. But the steering wheel was turning slightly with the curves of the road. And the truck never slowed down. The moment I saw the empty seat clearly, my whole body went tense. I stared at the mirror longer than I should have. My brain kept trying to explain what I was seeing. Maybe the driver was sitting very low. Maybe they had leaned to the side. Maybe something inside the cab blocked my view. But the light inside the truck stayed on, and the seat stayed empty. The steering wheel kept moving slightly as the road curved through the forest. At that point, I stopped trying to understand it. I just wanted distance. I pressed the accelerator and let my truck pick up speed. The trailer behind me rattled a little as the engine pushed harder. The road was still wet from earlier rain, so I had to be careful not to go too fast. For a moment, it worked. The headlights behind me started to shrink. The following truck was falling back. I felt a small bit of relief and kept driving. My eyes stayed on the road, but every few seconds, I checked the mirror again. The lights kept getting farther away. Eventually, they were just two small points in the fog. Another 10 minutes passed. Then the road curved around a hill, and the headlights disappeared completely. I remember letting out a slow breath I did not realize I had been holding. The rest of the drive toward Tacoma felt long, but nothing else strange happened. The fog slowly cleared as I got closer to the highway. Traffic started appearing again. Regular cars, normal trucks, people heading toward early morning jobs. Everything looked normal again. When I reached the warehouse outside the city, the sky was just beginning to get lighter. I parked my truck and stepped out to stretch my legs. My whole body still felt tight from the drive. One of the warehouse workers walked over while I was opening the trailer doors. He looked at my truck for a moment and then said something that made my stomach drop. He asked why I had been driving so slowly earlier on the forest road. I told him I was not driving slowly. He shook his head and said he passed me about 30 minutes back while coming the other direction. He said my truck had been crawling along the road like something heavy was in front of it. But he also said something else. He told me there was no truck in front of me and no truck behind me, just my trailer moving slowly through the fog. I never told him what I had seen in my mirrors that night, but even now, months later, there is one detail that still bothers me. When I checked the back of my trailer that morning, the metal door was covered in long streaks across the surface, not scratches from branches. They looked more like long marks dragged slowly across the metal, almost like something had been moving its hands along the back of the trailer for miles while I was driving through the forest. I took a solo hiking trip in the Pacific Northwest. I had always wanted to explore that part of the United States. The forests there are famous for being quiet, massive, and almost ancient. Some of the trees are so tall that when you stand under them, you feel like a tiny part of the world. I flew into Washington State and rented a small car. My plan was simple. I would spend a few days hiking in different areas, take photos, and enjoy being far away from crowded cities. One morning, I drove out toward a trail that a local guy recommended to me at a small diner. He said it was not a very popular trail, but the view at the end was beautiful. He also said most tourists never go there because it was a little harder to reach. That sounded perfect to me. The road leading there was narrow and surrounded by thick forest. The deeper I drove, the more the phone signal disappeared. Soon my phone showed no service at all. That did not worry me too much. I had a map downloaded, and I told a friend where I planned to go. When I reached the small parking area, there were only 2 other cars there. The place felt very quiet. No voices, no sound of traffic, just the wind moving through tall trees. I grabbed my backpack, some water, and started walking. At first, the trail was easy. The ground was soft with layers of old leaves and pine needles. Sunlight moved slowly through the tall branches above me. The air smelled fresh and slightly damp. For the first hour, everything felt peaceful. I even passed a small stream where the water moved slowly between rocks. It was the kind of place that makes you forget about time. But after a while, something began to feel slightly different. It is hard to explain, but the forest slowly started to feel too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just quiet in a way that made me notice it. Normally in forests, you hear birds, insects, small animals moving around. But after I walked deeper into the trail, I realized I was not hearing much of anything. I stopped walking for a moment and listened. Nothing. No birds. No distant sounds. Just the wind moving high above in the trees. At that moment, I remember telling myself I was probably just imagining things. Forests can feel strange when you are alone for a long time. Your brain starts paying attention to every little detail. So I kept hiking. About 20 minutes later, the trail became narrower. Plants grew closer to the path, and the trees looked even older. Some of them were so wide that 3 people probably could not wrap their arms around them. That was when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt ahead of me, but they looked fresh. That was strange because I had not seen anyone on the trail since I started hiking. At first, I assumed someone had walked ahead of me earlier that morning. But as I kept following the trail, something slowly began to bother me. The footprints were always the same distance ahead. Not getting farther, away, not getting closer. Just always there. Almost like whoever made them was walking just a little bit ahead of me. And somehow, I never saw them. I remember stopping again and looking down the trail as far as I could see. There was nobody there, just trees, endless trees, and a narrow path disappearing into the forest. For the first time that day, I started to feel a small sense of unease in my chest. It was the kind of feeling you get when something is not exactly wrong yet, but your instincts start paying attention. I told myself it was nothing. But about 10 minutes later, something happened that made me completely stop walking. Because up ahead on the trail, I saw a backpack sitting on the ground, and there was nobody around it. I slowed down as I got closer to the backpack. It was sitting right in the middle of the trail, like someone had just set it down for a moment. The bag looked worn, but not old. Dark green fabric, a few dirt marks, and one of the straps was stretched out across the ground. I stood there for a few seconds, looking around. The forest was still very quiet. I expected to hear someone nearby. Maybe the owner had stepped off the trail for a moment. Maybe they were taking pictures or resting somewhere behind the trees. But I did not see anyone. I walked a little closer and looked at the bag without touching it. One of the side pockets was open. I could see a water bottle inside. The main zipper was slightly open too, just enough to show a folded jacket. It looked like a normal hiking bag, not something that had been there for days. I called out politely, just in case the owner was nearby. "Hello? Is this your bag?" My voice sounded strange in the quiet forest. The sound seemed to disappear quickly between the trees. No answer. I waited for a moment. Still nothing. I remember feeling unsure about what to do. Part of me thought the owner would come back any second, but another part of me felt uncomfortable standing there alone next to someone else's things. I looked down the trail again. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach feel tight. The footprints I had been following earlier, they stopped right next to the backpack. They did not continue down the trail. They just ended there. I stared at the dirt for a while, trying to make sense of it. The ground ahead of the bag was smooth. No new footprints, no marks from shoes leaving the trail. It looked like whoever walked there simply stopped existing at that spot. I know that sounds dramatic, but that is exactly what it looked like. I tried to think of normal explanations. Maybe the person stepped off the trail onto rocks or roots where prints would not show. Maybe they climbed a small slope nearby. So I looked around more carefully. To the left of the trail was thick brush and fallen branches. To the right was a small hill covered in moss and tall ferns. I walked a few steps in both directions, but did not see any clear path someone could have taken. The forest floor there was soft. If someone had walked through it, there should have been some kind of mark, but there was nothing. At that point, I started feeling like I should probably turn around. Not because of danger exactly, but because the whole situation felt strange. Still, curiosity can be powerful. I stepped around the backpack and continued walking down the trail. The air felt cooler now. The trees were even thicker in this part of the forest, and the sunlight barely reached the ground. The path curved slightly and began going uphill. As I walked, I kept thinking about the missing hiker. Maybe they were injured somewhere nearby. Maybe they left the bag to explore something. Or maybe they would come back and think I was the strange one for standing near their things. After about 15 minutes, I reached a small clearing where the trail widened slightly. There was a large fallen tree lying across part of the open area. That was when I noticed something else that made the situation even more confusing. There were new footprints in the dirt again, the same kind I had seen earlier. But this time, they were not ahead of me. They were behind me. Fresh marks in the soft soil, leading in the exact direction I had just walked from. I stood there, slowly turning around, staring down the trail. My heart started beating faster as I studied the ground, because those prints had not been there before. I was completely certain of that. I had walked that exact path only minutes earlier, and the dirt had been smooth. Now it clearly showed the shape of someone's shoes following the same route I had taken. But the trail behind me was empty. No voices, no movement, just the long path disappearing back into the deep forest. And for the first time during that hike, I started to feel like I might not be alone out there. I stood in that clearing for a long time, staring at the footprints behind me. They looked fresh. The edges were sharp in the soft dirt, the same way mine looked when I turned and checked my own steps. Whoever made them had walked in the exact direction I came from, but I had not passed anyone. That was the part that made my chest feel tight. There is something about being deep in a forest that changes how you think. When you are surrounded by thousands of trees and there is no phone signal, every small detail suddenly matters more. I slowly walked back a few steps and looked closer at the ground. The prints looked like normal hiking shoes, not boots, just regular trail shoes with a simple pattern on the bottom. The size looked similar to mine. For a moment, I even compared them with my own footprints nearby. They were different. Not by much, but enough to tell they were not mine. I stood there quietly, trying to listen for anything around me. Maybe someone was walking nearby. Maybe they were moving through the trees and I just could not see them. But the forest stayed the same. Very still, very quiet. I remember thinking that if someone was following me, they were doing it in a very strange way. Normally, you would hear something, a branch moving, leaves shifting, something that tells you another person is nearby. But there was nothing like that. Just the feeling that someone had been walking behind me without making any sound at all. At that point, I decided it was time to head back to the parking area. The view at the end of the trail no longer mattered to me. The strange backpack and the disappearing footprints were enough for one day, so I turned around and started walking back the way I came. At first, I walked slowly, still trying to stay calm. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe another hiker had stepped carefully along the edges of the trail where I did not notice. But after a few minutes, something else began to bother me. The footprints behind me were still there, but they were not stopping where I stopped earlier. They continued forward. Step after step in the same direction, I was now walking. I followed them with my eyes down the path, and the farther I looked, the more my stomach dropped, because the prints did not lead back toward the parking area. They led deeper into the forest, right to the spot where the backpack was sitting earlier. I continued walking, trying not to think too much about it. The trail felt longer than before. The tall trees blocked most of the sunlight, making the forest feel darker, even though it was still daytime. After about 20 minutes, I reached the place where I had seen the backpack. But when I looked at the ground, I stopped again. The backpack was gone. The middle of the trail was empty now. No bag, no jacket, no water bottle. Just the same narrow path running through the forest. I looked around quickly, scanning the trees and the thick plants on both sides. There was no sign that someone had picked it up recently. The ground looked undisturbed. The only thing still there were the footprints, but now there were more of them. Several sets, walking in different directions across the dirt. Some of them crossed the trail and disappeared into the trees. Others continued along the path. I stood there trying to make sense of it, but something inside me had already decided what to do. I needed to leave. Not slowly, not casually. Just leave. So I started walking faster down the trail toward the parking area. My backpack felt heavier now, even though nothing had changed inside it. Every few minutes I glanced behind me. The trail stayed empty. But after a while, another strange detail began to settle into my mind. The footprints behind me were still appearing. Fresh ones. Right on the path I had just walked. Like someone was calmly following my exact steps. And the worst part was this. No matter how many times I looked back down that trail, I never saw anyone. By point, I was no longer trying to stay calm. I kept moving down the trail, walking faster than before. Every part of my body felt tense. I was listening to every tiny change in the forest around me, even though the silence never really changed. The trees seemed closer now. The path looked longer than it had earlier that day. It is strange how distance feels different when your mind starts filling with worry. I checked the ground again while walking. My footprints were easy to see in the soft dirt. But behind them, only a few feet back, were the other ones. Still there. Still following. Step after step. I forced myself not to turn around too often. Every time I did, the trail was empty. No person. No movement between the trees. Just that quiet forest stretching in every direction. After about 15 minutes of walking quickly, I finally began to recognize parts of the trail from earlier in the day. The small stream appeared again beside the path, moving gently between the rocks. Seeing it gave me a small sense of relief. The parking area could not be much farther, but something else happened right after that. As I crossed the stream and continued along the trail, I noticed something in the dirt that made me slow down again. The footprints ahead of me were back, the same ones I had seen earlier that morning. They were already on the trail in front of me, walking in the same direction I was going. That meant one thing. Somehow, whoever made them was now ahead of me again. My mind tried to reject that idea immediately. I had been watching the trail behind me for most of the walk back. I never saw anyone pass me, and there was no other path nearby that someone could have used to move ahead. But the prints were clear, fresh, leading toward the parking area. I kept walking, but now I felt like I was stuck inside a strange loop. The same situation repeating again and again. Footprints ahead, footprints behind, but no person anywhere. Eventually the trees began to thin out, and I saw the small open space of the parking area through the branches. My car was still there, along with the two others I had seen earlier. I walked out of the forest and stepped onto the gravel. At that moment, the feeling of pressure in my chest finally started to ease a little. Being in an open space felt very different from being surrounded by trees. I turned around one last time and looked at the trail entrance. The forest looked completely normal again, quiet but peaceful. For a few seconds, I just stood there watching the path. And then I noticed something that made the back of my neck feel cold. At the edge of the dirt trail, just before the gravel of the parking area, there was one final footprint, only one. Right at the border where the forest met the open space, it faced toward me. But there were no other prints around it, nothing leading to it, nothing leading away. Just a single mark in the dirt, like someone had taken one step out of the trees and then stopped. I got into my car not long after that and drove away from the area. I did not stay to hike anywhere else that day. Maybe there is a simple explanation for what I saw. Maybe I misunderstood something about the trail or the ground, but I still think about that hike sometimes, especially one detail. The footprints were always the same distance from me, not rushing, not getting closer, just quietly following along the trail, like something in that forest wanted to walk beside me, without ever letting me see it.